Chief Flight Attendant Vivian Brooks's voice rang out loud enough for everyone in the passenger cabin at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, Texas, to hear. "I'm asking you one last time, move to the back of the plane, or I'll call security." Her words were sharp, her tone dripping with contempt. Clarence Thompson, a 75-year-old black man, calmly looked up at her. "I've told you, I'm not moving anywhere," he replied, his voice steady, almost gentle, but carrying an undeniable strength. He wore a faded baseball cap, a gift from his son Malcolm, and a threadbare cotton shirt worn at the cuffs, layered with a thin gray sweater. Over his shoulder hung an old canvas bag, holding a few simple items: a dog-eared book, a handkerchief, and a yellowed family photo. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss the latest stories. He was being humiliated in front of everyone, but no one expected what would happen next, when the old man they thought was powerless stood up and revealed the truth about his identity, or rather, about his son. As we step into this story, if you believe people should be treated with respect regardless of their skin color, picture this scene. The plane gleamed under the afternoon sun in Dallas, its sleek design promising a luxurious journey for the passengers inside. Clarence was on his way to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Washington, to attend the grand opening of the new headquarters for Thompson Skyline, the airline owned by his son Malcolm Thompson. Inside the cabin was a scene of opulence: soft leather seats, gold-trimmed accents, and an air of exclusivity that made everyone feel like royalty upon stepping aboard. A small photo of Clarence and Malcolm hung near the entrance, a subtle family mark amid the grandeur. Passengers boarded, rolling expensive suitcases lightly across the floor. First came the Harper family, a middle-aged couple, with their 6-year-old son, Billy. Mr. Harper pulled a glossy leather suitcase, while Miss Harper, in an elegant floral dress, held Billy's hand as the curious boy looked around. They settled in the front row, Billy quickly fiddling with the iPad his mom handed him. Next was Margaret Evans, a wealthy woman in her 50s, wearing a fur coat and oversized sunglasses. She strode in regally, pulling a designer suitcase, and scanning everyone with a scrutinizing gaze. Finally, James Carter, a friendly 40-something businessman, in a light gray suit, carried a polished leather briefcase. He smiled at Clarence as he passed, nodding a greeting before taking a seat across the aisle. The passengers quickly settled in, some scrolling on phones, others sipping champagne from glasses brought by the crew. Soft music played in the cabin, blending with quiet chatter. Clarence sat still, his gaze fixed out the window, where the runway stretched under the sunlight. He had no intention of revealing his identity, that he was the father of Malcolm Thompson, who owned the plane and the airline. He preferred to keep it quiet, at least for now. Clarence Thompson entered the cabin, his calm demeanor drawing a few curious glances. His steps were slow, his eyes sweeping the space once before he chose a window seat and set his canvas bag on the floor. This trip wasn't just a routine flight, it was a chance to witness his son's growing empire. Though no one on board knew who he was, he liked it that way, keeping things discreet, at least for now. Vivian Brooks stood near the entrance, her crisp navy uniform perfectly pressed, her sharp features exuding control. At 45, she moved with the confidence of someone always in charge, holding a passenger list in hand. She greeted each person, her smile warm for some, icy for others. She prided herself on maintaining order on the plane, but her idea of order often hinged on a passenger's appearance or behavior. Her tone shifted noticeably when she saw Clarence, offering a curt welcome aboard, devoid of warmth. Behind him, the Harper family took their seats. Mr. and Mrs. Harper, a middle-aged couple, carried the ease of seasoned travelers. Mrs. Harper held a small bag, her fingers itching to knit, while Mr. Harper carried a neatly folded newspaper, his face showing mild curiosity as he glanced around. Vivian beamed at them. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Harper, so wonderful to have you with us again." Clarence glanced over his shoulder, noting the stark difference in Vivian's tone, but his face remained calm. though his eyes glinted with an understanding of the subtle dynamics at play. As other passengers settled in, Vivian moved through the cabin, checking everything. She paused at the Harpers, smiling brightly. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Mrs. Harper shook her head politely, already starting to knit, while Mr. Harper nodded toward his coffee, signaling he was content. When Vivian passed Clarence, her demeanor shifted. She glanced at the old canvas bag at his feet, her lips tightening into a thin line. She offered him none of the courtesy or warmth she gave others, simply walking by without a word. Clarence sat still, hands clasped on his lap. He was used to looks like that from years of being turned away in Dallas, just for his skin color or modest appearance. Vivian stood before Clarence Thompson, arms crossed, her sharp gaze boring into his worn shirt, as if it offended her. The cabin still hummed with soft music, but the air around her and Clarence grew heavy. "I don't think you understand," she said, her voice sharper, each word like a small dagger. "This area is for our premium passengers, and I know exactly who belongs here and who doesn't." Clarence sat still, hands still clasped, his steady gaze meeting her. "You can check your passenger list," he replied, his voice low and deliberate, unwavering. "I believe you'll find my name there." Vivian's forced smile didn't falter, but her eyes flashed with irritation. "I don't need to check anything," she snapped, her tone slicing through the cabin's calm. "I know who belongs here, and who doesn't." Her voice carried, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Margaret Evans, the wealthy woman in the fur coat, leaned over for a better look, her eyes behind sunglasses glinting with curiosity. James Carter, the businessman across the aisle, frowned slightly, his gaze flickering with unease at Vivian's attitude. Billy, the Harper boy, looked up from his iPad, whispering to his mom, "Why's she mad at that old man?" Mrs. Harper shook her head gently, shushing him. Clarence didn't react to the eyes turning toward him. He sat upright, his faded cap tilted slightly, maintaining his calm, as if the confrontation didn't faze him. But deep down, he felt the familiarity of the situation. Times in Dallas, when he'd been dismissed for his skin or simple clothes. He recalled an afternoon decades ago when he was chased out of a cafe for daring to sit at the whites-only counter. No one spoke up for him then, and he'd learned to stand his ground without shouting. Now, on his son's plane, he resolved not to budge. Vivian, not getting the reaction she expected, stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. "If you don't move to the back of the plane," she said, louder for all to hear, "I'll have to call security." Clarence tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Call whoever you want," he replied, his voice even, almost soft, "but I'm not moving anywhere." His words were a cool breeze against Vivian's rising heat, only stoking her anger further. Margaret Evans let out a soft "oh," covering her mouth as if watching a drama unfold. James Carter leaned forward, his brows knitting tighter, clearly disapproving of Vivian's approach. The cabin's atmosphere grew taut as a bowstring. A few passengers exchanged glances, murmuring quietly, "Why doesn't he just move if he's in the wrong seat?" One whispered, "Probably fishing for a free ticket." Another shrugged. Vivian stood firm, arms crossed, her stance radiating authority. "If you don't move," she repeated, her voice rising, "I'll have security here right now." Clarence didn't respond immediately. He looked at her, his deep brown eyes glinting with a resolve she hadn't anticipated. "Do what you need to do," he said, his voice still calm, but carrying a weight that made Vivian falter for a moment. Vivian turned to Sophie Lee, a young flight attendant nearby, her eyes blazing with frustration. Sophie, timid and clutching her hands, had watched the scene unfold, without daring to speak. "Sophie," Vivian barked, her tone harsh, "take him to the back now." Sophie hesitated, her gaze darting between Clarence and Vivian. She wanted to say something, perhaps suggest checking the list, as Clarence had hinted, but Vivian's piercing stare froze her. Finally, she nodded reluctantly, and stepped toward Clarence, her voice soft, "Please, sir, come with me." Clarence looked at her, his gaze softening slightly. "You should think carefully before you do anything," he said gently, his words carrying a weight Vivian didn't catch. Vivian scoffed, waving off his warning. I know exactly what I'm doing, she said, her voice hardening. Get up now. But Clarence didn't budge. He sat there, hands still clasped, his steady gaze locked on Vivian. His silence was a quiet challenge, unsettling her, though she masked it with bravado. You don't belong here, she pressed, her voice tinged with impatience. You don't fit in this space. Clarence tilted his head, his eyes unwavering. You shouldn't rush to judge people, he said softly, his voice low but clear. Vivian smirked, her confidence returning. And you shouldn't sit where you haven't paid to be, she shot back, dripping with sarcasm. Then he quietly picked up his cap, which had fallen to the seat beside him, a gift from Malcolm. Put it back on, his gaze still fixed on Vivian. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice quiet but sharp, a warning hanging in the air. Vivian sneered, her forced smile twisting into a mocking curl. I've been doing this long enough to know who belongs here, and who doesn't. Her words rang out like an unchallengeable decree, turning more heads. Margaret Evans leaned over, whispering loud enough for others to hear. He's probably trying to scam a free ticket. James Carter's frown deepened, his eyes flashing with quiet indignation, though he stayed silent. Billy looked up from his iPad, asking his mom innocently, what'd he do wrong to make her so mad? Mrs. Harper shook her head, whispering, quiet, Billy, don't get involved. Clarence ignored the murmurs around him. He remembered an afternoon in Dallas, years ago, when a waiter chased him out of a diner for daring to use the front door. He'd left in silence then, but this time was different. This was his son's plane, and he wouldn't be pushed aside like he didn't belong. You shouldn't rush to judge people, he said again, his voice low but clear, repeating his earlier warning. Vivian laughed, a short, dry sound. And you shouldn't sit where you haven't paid to be, she retorted, her sarcasm meant to force him to move. But Clarence didn't stir. He sat there, hands clasped, his calm gaze unyielding, a rock against her rushing tide. His silence rattled her, though she hid it behind a tough exterior. She turned to Sophie Lee again, her eyes flashing with fury. Sophie, what are you standing there for? She snapped. Take him to the back now. Sophie hesitated, hands clenched, her gaze flickering between Clarence and Vivian. She wanted to speak, maybe remind Vivian to check the list, but Vivian's cutting glare paralyzed her. Finally, she stepped closer to Clarence, her voice soft, almost pleading. Please, sir, come with me. Clarence looked at her, his gaze gentler. You should think carefully before you do anything, he said softly, his words heavy with meaning. Vivian ignored. Vivian waved off his warning like swatting a fly. I know exactly what I'm doing, she said, her voice steely. Get up now. But Clarence stayed put. He sat there, his steady gaze locked on Vivian, his silence a quiet defiance. You don't belong here, she repeated, her voice trembling slightly with anger. You don't fit in this space. Clarence tilted his head, his eyes unwavering. You shouldn't rush to judge people, he said again, his voice low but sharp, a warning lingering in the air. The cabin's tension thickened. Passengers murmured louder, their eyes fixed on Clarence and Vivian. Why won't he just move? One whispered. He's probably looking for trouble, another replied. Margaret Evans covered her mouth, giggling as if watching a play. James Carter leaned forward, brows tightly knit, clearly unhappy with Vivian's handling. Mr. Harper folded his newspaper, glancing over his shoulder curiously, while Mrs. Harper kept knitting, trying to hush Billy. Vivian stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply, her voice rising. I'm asking you one last time, move to the back of the plane, or I'll call security. Clarence looked at her, his gaze as calm as a still lake. I've told you, I'm not moving anywhere, he replied, his voice even, almost gentle, but carrying a strength that made Vivian pause. His resolve fueled her fury further. You think you can sit here and no one can touch you, she shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin. We have rules, and some people never respect them. Clarence didn't respond to her insult, or the growing murmurs around him. He kept his gaze fixed on Vivian, his calm a wordless rebellion. Sophie stood nearby, hands trembling, her eyes darting to the passenger list near the cockpit door. She wanted to check it, to say something to defuse the situation, but Vivian spun around, barking, "Sophie, what are you doing? I told you to stay out of this." Sophie stepped back, her face flushing with embarrassment, lips pressed tight as if holding something back. James Carter finally spoke up, his voice low and calm from across the aisle. "Excuse me, is everything okay here?" he asked, his eyes showing concern for Clarence. Clarence turned, his face softening slightly. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied, his voice gentle but tinged with gratitude for the small kindness. But before James could say more, Vivian cut in, her tone sharp. "Sir, I'd appreciate it if you didn't encourage this disruption." She turned back to Clarence, pointing at him. "You're causing a scene." James frowned, replying, "From where I'm sitting, you're the one making a fuss." Vivian's face reddened with anger, but she ignored James, focusing her full wrath on Clarence. Vivian's face flushed with rage, her red lips tightening into a thin line. "Who do you think you are, sitting here?" she shouted, her voice shaking with loss of control. "You don't belong here, and I won't let you disrupt this any longer." Clarence sat up straighter, his eyes fearless. "I'm just asking to be treated like everyone else," he said softly, his voice low but clear, more a reminder than a protest. But to Vivian, it was a thorn in her pride. She stepped closer, her heels clacking loudly, pointing in his face. "You don't deserve my respect," she spat, her voice thick with disdain. "People like you never do." Her words were a stone thrown into still water, rippling through the cabin. Margaret Evans covered her mouth, chuckling as if watching a dramatic play. James Carter half stood, eyes blazing with anger, but he held back, waiting to see what Clarence would do. Billy, the Harper boy, shrank into his mom's arms, his wide eyes full of fear. Mr. Harper folded his newspaper, glancing over with curiosity, while Mrs. Harper stopped knitting, whispering to Billy, "Don't look, honey." But all eyes were on Clarence, awaiting his reaction. But Clarence didn't shout, didn't stand, didn't do anything but keep his steady gaze locked on Vivian. He recalled another time in Dallas, when a shopkeeper yelled in his face just for asking the price of a shirt. He'd left silently then, but this time was different. This was Malcolm's plane, his son's, and he wouldn't be pushed aside like he didn't belong. "You're making a mistake," he said softly, his voice low but sharp, a final warning. Vivian laughed dryly, waving off his words. "I'm not afraid of your empty threats," she shot back, dripping with sarcasm. "You're the one who'll regret this, not me." Vivian turned, storming down the aisle, her heels tapping out her fury on the floor. She returned with a tray of sparkling water, her demeanor professional, but her face taut as a wire. She served the Harpers first, forcing a smile, as she handed glasses to Mr. and Mrs. Harper. "Anything I can get you?" she asked, her voice falsely sweet. Mr. Harper shook his head, while Mrs. Harper nodded slightly, her knitting needles still in hand. Vivian moved on, serving Margaret and James, but when she neared Clarence, she pointedly ignored him. Clarence sat still, watching her, waiting. He raised a hand gently, his voice soft. "Excuse me, could I have a glass of water?" Vivian stopped, turning to him with a look of contempt. "I'll get to you when I'm free," she snapped, then walked past without a glance back. Clarence said nothing more, just sat quietly, his calm gaze tracking her retreating figure. He stretched his legs slightly into the aisle, trying to get comfortable in the soft leather seat. Vivian returned with a nearly empty tray, her sharp eyes catching his small movement. Instead of asking him to move his legs, she quickened her pace, and in a split second, her foot slammed into his. The tray tilted, sparkling glasses tipping over, cold water splashing onto his gray sweater, and the floor. Vivian cried out theatrically, her voice shrill, "Look what you've done, sticking your feet out like that." Passengers jolted, turning as the sound of shattering glass rang out like a small explosion. Clarence looked up, briefly surprised but still calm, brushing water off his sweater. "But you ran into my leg," he said, his voice low and clear. Vivian stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "You think you can talk to me like that?" she snarled, her voice trembling with rage. "I'm just asking to be treated like everyone else," Clarence replied, tilting his head slightly, his gaze steady. "And if that's too hard for you, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." His words struck Vivian's pride like a blow. She froze for a second, her face flushing red, hands shaking with fury. "You dare say that to me?" she screamed, her voice cutting like a knife. And then, in a moment of lost control, Vivian raised her hand and slapped Clarence hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed like thunder through the cabin, stunning everyone. James Carter leapt up, his face a mix of shock and outrage. Sophie Lee, nearby, clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide with panic. Margaret Evans gasped, her curious smile vanishing, replaced by disbelief. Billy wailed, burying himself in his mom's arms. Clarence's face showed no anger, but his deep brown eyes glinted with a weight that made Vivian step back. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he said softly, his voice low but piercing, cutting through the air like a blade. Vivian stood there, hand trembling, her face paling as something dawned on her, but she quickly regained her hardness. "I've had enough," she growled, her voice shaky with rage. "Either you move, or I'll make sure you're dragged off this plane." Clarence didn't reply. He sat still, his steady gaze locked on Vivian, unshaken by her threat. His silence was a quiet challenge, unnerving her further. "You think you can defy me?" she shouted, her voice shrill. "You'll regret wasting my time." But before she could act, James Carter, the businessman across the aisle, stood up, his voice low and firm. "From where I'm sitting," he said, his eyes blazing with anger at Vivian. "You're the one causing trouble." Vivian spun toward him, her face red. "I'd appreciate it if you'd sit down and stay out of this," she snapped, pointing at him. James frowned but sat, his gaze still fixed on her. Other passengers murmured louder, their eyes locked on Clarence and Vivian. Margaret Evans whispered to the person beside her, her tone a mix of curiosity and shock. "He's still sitting there after that slap?" Billy, nestled in his mom's arms, whimpered, "Mommy, she hit that old man." Mrs. Harper held him tight, whispering, "Don't look, Billy." Mr. Harper folded his newspaper, his eyes flickering with unease, but staying silent. Sophie Lee, still covering her mouth, stood frozen, her wide eyes darting between Clarence and Vivian, hands trembling as if she wanted to act, but couldn't. Vivian turned back to Clarence, pointing at his face again. "Get up now," she screamed, her voice cracking with fury. "You're wasting everyone's time." But Clarence didn't move. He sat there, his steady gaze on her, hands still clasped on his lap. "You shouldn't do this," he said softly, his voice low but heavy, making Vivian pause. "You'll regret it." Vivian scoffed, waving off his words. "Regret," she said, dripping with sarcasm. "You're the one who'll regret crossing me." She turned, storming down the aisle, her heels clicking furiously, as if to leave the scene behind. But Sophie Lee couldn't stand by any longer. From the start of the flight, she'd watched Vivian's treatment of Clarence, and the slap was the final straw. She slipped out of Vivian's sight, her hands shaking, as she pulled her phone from her uniform pocket. She dialed quickly, her voice low but firm, as someone answered. "This is Sophie," she whispered, glancing around to ensure no one heard. "We've got a situation on the plane." She returned to her spot near the cockpit, her face tense but resolute. She knew she couldn't let this go on without acting. Meanwhile, Vivian returned to the cabin, her stance rigid but her eyes betraying unease. She stood before Clarence again, arms crossed, her voice cold. "I'm asking you one last time, move to the back of the plane, or I'll call security." Clarence looked at her, his gaze as calm as a still lake. "I've told you, I'm not moving anywhere," he replied, his voice even, almost gentle, but carrying a strength that made Vivian step back. His resolve stoked her fury further. "You think you can sit here and no one can touch you," she shouted, her voice ringing through the cabin. Just then, footsteps echoed from the front. The cockpit door swung open, and Captain David Monroe, the lead pilot, stepped out, his face stern. He scanned the cabin, his eyes landing on Vivian and Clarence. He strode forward, exuding authority, his voice low but firm. "You need to step back, Vivian." Vivian turned to him, her face flashing confusion. "What's going on?" she demanded, her tone sharp. "I'm handling this." Captain Monroe glanced at Clarence, then back at Vivian, his gaze unyielding. "I just got a call from management," he said, his voice clear and cold. "The owner of this plane is on board, and it's this man's son." His words hit like a thunderclap, sparking gasps and murmurs of shock through the cabin. Margaret Evans gaped, whispering, "His son owns this plane?" James Carter nodded slightly, a hint of satisfaction in his eyes, as if he'd suspected something. Billy looked up from his mom's arms, asking innocently, "Is he important?" Sophie, nearby, relaxed slightly, as the truth came out. Vivian paled, her arms dropping, her voice stammering. "No, it can't be. There's got to be a mistake." But Captain Monroe shook his head, his tone firm. "No mistake. He's the father of Malcolm Thompson, owner of Thompson Skyline." Passengers turned to each other, the air thick with astonishment and indignation. Margaret Evans whispered louder, "His son owns the whole airline?" James Carter nodded again, his eyes glinting with quiet approval. Billy asked his mom, "He's a big deal, huh?" Mrs. Harper hugged him tight, nodding silently, while Mr. Harper shot Vivian a cold look. Sophie stood nearby, relief washing over her face, still clutching her phone from the call. But Vivian tried to protest, her voice weak. "I didn't know. How could I have known?" She turned to Clarence, her eyes wild with panic and anger. "Why didn't you say anything from the start?" Clarence looked at her, his gaze calm but piercing. "I don't have to explain who I am," he said softly, his voice low but powerful. "I just wanted to be treated like everyone else." His words cut through Vivian's pride like a knife, making her step back, her face red with shame and panic. But before she could say more, a voice boomed over the cabin speakers. "This is Captain Monroe," it said, deep and clear. "We'll be making an emergency landing at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, Arizona, per management's orders. Everyone please stay calm." The cabin buzzed again, but no one dared ask more. The plane tilted slightly, adjusting course. Vivian stood frozen, her face ashen, hands trembling as she realized the consequences closing in. Clarence sat still, gazing out the window where the Dallas runway gleamed under the sun. He didn't need to do anything more. The situation was now out of Vivian's hands. After a short time, the plane touched down at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. The engines quieted, and the cabin door opened. Outside, the sound of a car approached, and a sleek black SUV pulled up beside the plane. The door swung open, and Malcolm Thompson stepped out, a tall man in his 40s, dressed in a sharp black suit, his face serious but eyes full of concern. Two assistants in gray suits followed, holding phones and tablets. Malcolm strode onto the plane, his eyes sweeping the cabin before locking on Clarence. "Dad," he called, his voice deep with emotion, rushing to embrace him. Clarence stood, his thin arms returning the hug, his eyes softening. "I'm fine, Malcolm," he said gently, patting his shoulder. "No need to make a fuss." But Malcolm shook his head, his gaze shifting to Vivian, now cowering near the cockpit door. "No, Dad," he said, his tone firm. "This can't be ignored." He stepped toward Vivian, his presence commanding, his eyes icy. "Who are you to lay a hand on my father?" he demanded, his voice low but cutting. Vivian stammered, her face pale. "I didn't know. I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. But Malcolm raised a hand to silence her. "You insulted my father," he said, unrelenting. "You humiliated him in front of everyone, and you think an apology fixes that." He turned to his assistants, issuing a curt order, "Call the police." One nodded, dialing immediately, while the other jotted notes on a tablet. Vivian stepped back, eyes wide with fear. No, please don't, she begged, her voice breaking. I didn't mean to. I didn't know who he was. But Malcolm didn't respond. He turned to his father, his gaze softening slightly. How do you want to handle this, Dad? He asked. Clarence looked at Vivian, his eyes calm but devoid of pity. Do what's right, he said softly, his voice low but clear. I don't want a scene, but this has to stop. Minutes later, police sirens wailed outside. 2 officers boarded the plane, their demeanor stern. Who's Vivian Brooks? One asked. Vivian shakily raised her hand, tears streaming down her face. I am, she said, her voice faint. The officer stepped forward, pulling out handcuffs. You're under arrest for assaulting a passenger, he said, his tone cold. Mr. Thompson has confirmed he wants to press charges. Vivian sobbed, reaching for Sophie's arm, but Sophie stepped back, her eyes tinged with pity, but staying out of it. Passengers began recording on their phones, the sound of clicks filling the cabin. James Carter whispered to the person beside him, "She deserves this." Margaret Evans nodded, her eyes glued to the scene. The videos spread online fast, with the hashtag #RespectForClarence popping up. Vivian was led off the plane, head bowed, her sobs fading as she disappeared through the door. Malcolm turned to embrace his father again, his eyes full of respect. "You shouldn't have had to go through this," he said, his voice low. Clarence smiled faintly, patting his shoulder. "I'm fine, Malcolm," he said. "But you're right, this has to stop." He nodded, then addressed the passengers, his voice clear. "I'm sorry for what you just witnessed. Thompson's skyline was built on respect and dignity, and today, that was broken. I promise to change things so this never happens again." Passengers nodded, some clapping lightly, their gazes shifting from Malcolm to Clarence with newfound admiration. James Carter spoke up. "I appreciate that. No one deserves what Mr. Thompson went through." Malcolm nodded thanks, his eyes showing gratitude for the support. Clarence raised a hand, signaling Malcolm to pause. He stood slowly, his thin frame radiating a quiet strength that silenced the cabin. He looked around, his gaze resting on each passenger, from the Harpers, Margaret Evans, to James Carter and Sophie Lee. "I don't need anyone to know who I am," he said, his voice low and deliberate, resonating like a lesson forged over decades. "I just want to be treated like a human, no more, no less." He paused, his eyes distant. "My mother told me back in Dallas, respect is something you give, not something you demand. I've lived my life by that, and I taught Malcolm the same." His words were a cool breeze through the cabin, easing the lingering tension. Malcolm stood beside him, eyes glistening as he heard his father echo old lessons. He remembered nights in their small Dallas shack, Clarence sitting with young Malcolm, teaching patience and self-respect amid hard times. Dad never yelled for respect, Malcolm thought, gazing at him with awe. Now, he saw those lessons come alive like never before. Clarence turned to Sophie Lee, still near the cockpit door, her face flushed with embarrassment and relief. "Thank you," he said gently, nodding to her. "You did the right thing." Sophie bowed her head, her voice soft. I just wanted this handled properly. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." Clarence smiled faintly, his eyes kind. "You spoke when it mattered," he said. "That's what counts." Malcolm stepped forward, placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "You gave me a chance to fix this," he said, his voice low but sincere. "From now on, you're the chief flight attendant on Thompson's Skyline flights. I need people like you, people who stand up for what's right." Sophie looked up, eyes wide with surprise, then nodded, her voice shaky. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I won't let you down." Passengers clapped lightly, some smiling at the unexpected turn. James Carter stood, approaching Clarence to shake his hand. "I admire you," he said, his voice earnest. "The way you stayed calm through all this, I'm not sure I could have done that." Clarence took his hand, smiling faintly. "Thank you," he said, "but sometimes, silence is the only way to let others see their own mistakes." Margaret Evans, who'd watched with curiosity earlier, stood too, her face tinged with regret. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything," she said, her voice quieter than usual. I should have spoken up. Clarence nodded, his gaze free of blame. You see it now, he said gently. That's what matters. Billy, the Harper boy, slipped from his mom's arms, running to Clarence with shining eyes. You're a good man, Grandpa, he said, his voice clear, hugging his leg. Clarence bent down, patting his head, his eyes warm. Thank you, he said, his voice low but gentle. You're a good boy too. Mrs. Harper smiled, pulling Billy back, her eyes touched with emotion. Mr. Harper nodded to Clarence, a silent acknowledgement. Malcolm addressed the passengers again, his voice firm. We'll arrange a new flight to Seattle immediately. I promise you, and my father, that Thompson's skyline will put respect first from now on. He looked at Clarence, eyes full of resolve. You taught me that, Dad, and I won't forget. Clarence nodded, a hint of pride in his gaze. He sat back down, looking out the window, as if he'd done all he needed to. The cabin slowly returned to normal, but the mood had shifted. Passengers chatted, their glances at Clarence now filled with respect, not curiosity. Sophie approached Captain Monroe, whispering something, then returned to her post with newfound confidence. James sat back, typing on his phone, perhaps a post about what he'd witnessed. Margaret quietly pulled out her phone, her eyes still on Clarence, as if memorizing the moment. The new crew, led by Sophie Lee, now chief flight attendant, greeted him with genuine smiles. Welcome, Mr. Thompson, Sophie said warmly, bringing him a glass of water. Clarence nodded, smiling faintly. Thank you, he said, his voice low but kind. As the plane leveled off, Clarence glanced around the cabin. James, a few rows away, smiled when their eyes met. The Harpers up front, Billy waving from afar, his face lit with joy. Margaret Evans, still poised, nodded slightly, her eyes tinged with regret. He said nothing, just nodded back, his calm gaze signaling the past was done. He didn't need attention or apologies, he wanted respect, and now he had it. Meanwhile, the story spread like wildfire. Videos from passengers at Phoenix flooded social media, with #respect for Clarence trending top. News outlets picked it up, from quick online posts to full TV segments. Malcolm Thompson appeared in a live interview from his Seattle office, his face stern but eyes resolute. My father taught me respect is everyone's right, not a privilege, he said, his voice deep over the airwaves. This was a wake-up call for Thompson's skyline. We've rolled out a new anti-discrimination policy, and I'm committed to enforcing it. The public cheered the statement, with thousands of comments online, from "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," to "This is how a company should act." Back at his Dallas home, Clarence received thank you letters from flight passengers. James Carter wrote, "You inspired me to stand up for what's right." Sophie sent a short message, "I won't forget your lesson." Even Margaret Evans penned a brief apology. "I was wrong to stay silent. Thank you." Clarence read each one, his eyes touched with emotion, but he didn't reply. To him, these weren't rewards. They were proof his patience and dignity had reached others. When the plane landed, Malcolm waited at the gate. He stood there, sharp in his black suit, eyes lighting up as Clarence stepped off. Passengers clapped lightly as he passed, some snapping photos, but he just smiled faintly, not pausing. Malcolm approached, hugging him amid a crowd of Thompson Skyline staff waiting to greet them. "Welcome to Seattle, Dad," he said, his voice low but warm. "Today's special, our new headquarters opens, and I wanted you here." Clarence patted his shoulder, eyes proud. "You've done well, Malcolm," he said. "I just want to see you hold true to what I taught you." The father and son entered the new headquarters, a modern glass building gleaming under Seattle's sun. Malcolm led Clarence to his office, where a familiar leather chair, like the one on the plane, sat by the window. "This is your spot, Dad," Malcolm said, smiling. Clarence sat, gazing out at the city, its skyscrapers rising against a blue sky. He remembered Dallas days, teaching Malcolm fairness and dignity in their rickety shack. Now, seeing his son lead an empire with integrity, he knew his story had sparked a bigger change. The story, flight attendant, slaps elderly black man, unaware his son owns the plane, mirrors social issues still alive in the U.S. today, especially discrimination based on appearance, race, and status, while offering a deep lesson on dignity and change. In the tale, Clarence Thompson, a 75-year-old black man with a humble look, is scorned and assaulted by Vivian Brooks, the chief flight attendant, simply because he doesn't fit her premium passenger image. Vivian's arrogance, from demanding he move to slapping him mid-cabin, reflects biases still woven into modern American society, where people are often judged by their exterior rather than their worth. Yet, Clarence is calm amid the insult, paired with the reveal that his son, Malcolm, owns the airline, shows the power of patience and personal dignity against injustice. The lesson here for real-life America today is don't judge others by their looks or circumstances, and always treat people with basic respect, no matter who they are. Look at Sophie Lee, who, though timid, called to report the incident, or James Carter, who spoke up for Clarence. They remind us courage and kindness can shift the tide, even in tough moments. In today's U.S., where debates on social justice and racial equity still burn hot, take a cue from Malcolm, who didn't just punish Vivian, but reformed Thompson's skyline with an anti-discrimination policy. Practical advice: if you see unfairness, like Clarence slapped for his skin and old shirt, don't stay silent like Margaret Evans at first. Act like Sophie or James, even in small ways. Above all, heed Clarence's words. Respect is something you give, a simple yet potent principle for a fairer society, from offices and schools to daily flights. If you think Clarence's story and its lesson on respect are worth sharing, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more meaningful tales. Thanks for joining us, and see you in the next video to keep exploring life's deeper values.